Imagine a brilliant woman erased by the system, forced to scrub floors while hiding a genius that once saved a company from collapse. Grace Morgan's shocking journey from janitor to cybersecurity hero reveals secrets of betrayal, resilience, and courage against overwhelming odds. How did she fight back when everyone doubted her? What dark conspiracies tried to silence her forever? If you're ready for a story of justice and redemption that will keep you on the edge of your seat, stay tuned. Where are you watching from? Comment below and don't forget to subscribe to hear the full story. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly as Grace Morgan moved between the gleaming tables of the executive conference suite, her mop gliding silently over the polished marble floor. She was on her third shift this week, midnight to 4, the time when the suits were long gone and the glass towers of Helios Systems became tomb quiet. She liked it that way. No questions, no stares, just her, the silence, and the code that still echoed faintly in her mind, like an old song she didn't dare sing out loud anymore. Tonight, though, something was off. As she passed by a sleek black console half hidden beneath a linen-draped banquet setup, she caught a flicker on the screen. Just a flash of movement in her peripheral vision. She froze, heart ticking faster. The terminal had been left on. Curious, she edged closer. The display glowed quietly, lines of code scrolling in an unfamiliar sequence. Her eyes narrowed. Grace leaned in. What she saw wasn't just a screensaver or a routine update. This was a live access point. Someone was remotely controlling the terminal, injecting foreign strings, bypassing authentication layers, rewriting command hierarchies in real time. And whoever it was, they weren't supposed to be here. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. Instinct kicked in, like muscle memory from another life. She tapped a few keys, paused the override sequence, and began pulling a temporary trace, nothing too invasive, just enough to confirm what she already feared. A breach, a small one, subtle, but clever. She didn't even hear the footsteps. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The voice cracked like a whip behind her, slicing through the air and slamming into her chest. She spun around, startled, eyes wide. Julian Hartman, CEO of Helios Systems. He stood in the doorway in a tailored charcoal suit, his tie slightly loosened, face carved in anger and disbelief. His eyes swept from her face to the open terminal, then back to her trembling hands. "This is a private system," he barked. "Who gave you permission?" Grace opened her mouth, flustered. "Sir, I was just cleaning and I saw the screen light up. I thought maybe someone had left it unsecured and—" Before she could finish, he stepped forward and slapped her. The sound cracked across the room like a gunshot. Her head snapped sideways from the force, cheek burning, eyes flooding with tears before she could stop them. "Get out," Julian snarled. "Now, I don't care what you think you were doing. Stay away from anything that doesn't have your name on it." Grace stumbled backward, one hand pressed to her face, the other gripping the cleaning rag like a shield. Her whole body trembled, not just from pain, but from something deeper, something worse. "I wasn't trying to steal anything," she said softly, voice quivering. "I was trying to stop something. There's a back door. Someone was injecting code." "I said out," he roared, already moving toward the intercom. She took another step back, swallowing the sob in her throat. Her pride screamed at her to run, but her instincts said something else. She glanced back at the screen. "Just look at the code," she whispered. "Please, just look." He didn't answer, didn't even look at her. His hand hovered over the comm panel, ready to call security, or worse. Grace turned toward the door, wiping her tears on her sleeve, refusing to let them fall. She reached for the handle. Then, behind her, a sound. A sharp intake of breath. She turned. Julian had paused. His hand was still raised but frozen. His eyes were locked on the screen. The lines of code she'd been examining had continued scrolling, untouched now, revealing a deeper pattern, streamlined, efficient, surgical. His gaze narrowed. No, it couldn't be. He stepped closer. The syntax, the nesting, the embedded comments written with deliberate clarity. He recognized it. Not just the structure, but the style, the handwriting of the code. It matched a patch that had saved their infrastructure from collapse 6 months ago. A patch no one had claimed. A patch that came from nowhere, under the initials GM. He had obsessed over it in private, trying to trace it. Had his engineers replicate it? They couldn't. The work was too refined, too clean. The ghost coder had remained anonymous, until now. He turned toward her slowly, expression shifting from fury to confusion, then something else, something almost like awe. "You wrote this?" he asked, his voice low now, uncertain, disbelieving. Grace hesitated, still gripping the door handle like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "I didn't think anyone would notice," she said hoarsely. "I saw the log skipping. I overheard your engineers talking about a flicker in the firewall. I couldn't just walk away." Julian stared. "GM," he murmured. "Grace Morgan," she confirmed. "The M is my mother's name. I used GM when I sent the patch." He blinked, processing. "But you're a janitor." "I wasn't always." The room fell quiet again. A different kind of silence, the kind that lingers after someone sees a ghost. Julian finally spoke. "What happened?" Grace looked down, her cheek still stinging, her eyes hollow but alive. "I was a junior developer at Genesis Data. No degree. Just hunger. I found a vulnerability in their financial backend. Microtransactions rerouted to an offshore shell, millions skimmed over months. I reported it quietly. A week later, my badge stopped working." Julian didn't interrupt. "They said I violated internal protocols. I was escorted out, blacklisted. I sent out over 100 applications. Silence. I was flagged. Risk. Disruption." She let out a short breath, brittle as glass. "I had a son to feed, so I took what I could. Cleaning gigs, night shifts, things that don't require references or trust." Julian's eyes flicked to the console again. "And this?" he asked. "I saw your system stutter. I remembered the structure. I accessed logs from the hallway terminal. Nothing secure. I recognized the injection pattern. I knew how to fix it. So I did." She paused, then added, quieter still, "I didn't want credit. I just didn't want to watch another company burn when I could stop it." He turned away from the console, stared at her again. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally. "I know. Please don't fire me," she whispered. "I wasn't trying to trespass. I was just trying to stop the damage." He didn't respond. Instead, he looked at her cheek, the red outline of his palm already fading, but not forgotten. He lowered his hand from the intercom. "Tomorrow, noon, my office." Grace blinked. "What?" "You're going to tell me everything." He didn't apologize, didn't smile, but he didn't strike her again. And somehow, that was enough to keep her standing. She watched him go, then turned back to the terminal, still lit with lines of logic and fire, and for the first time in years, she let herself wonder, could this be the beginning again? The next morning, Grace stood outside Julian's office. Same uniform, same bruised cheek under a thin layer of powder. No one looked at her, not the receptionist, not the junior executives bustling past. They saw a cleaner with no last name. At exactly 12:07, the door opened. Julian stood there. His face was unreadable. "Come in," he said. She did. She stepped into a room that smelled like cedarwood and citrus, power and precision distilled into interior design. "Sit," he gestured. She obeyed. He stood with his back to her, gazing out over Manhattan. Then, finally, he spoke. "You're the one who wrote the patch." It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Why didn't you come forward?" "Because no one would have believed me, and if they had, it would have ruined me." He turned slowly. "Explain." And so, she did. For the next 20 minutes, Grace unpacked everything. Her time at Genesis, her fall, her silence, her coding under aliases, her choice to help Helios anonymously, her son, the night shifts, the fear, and the fire that still burned in her despite it all. When she finished, she reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a scuffed USB drive. "This has every patch I ever wrote, time-stamped, signed." Julian didn't touch it. He just stared at it. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. 4 months. He stood up, walked to the window, stared out as if recalibrating the entire architecture of the world he thought he knew. Finally, he turned back. "You shouldn't be cleaning floors." Grace laughed, dry and sharp. "Tell that to HR." "They were wrong." "No," she replied. "They were powerful. That's all it takes." Julian picked up the flash drive, turned it in his hands. "Tomorrow," he said, "you'll meet the engineering team. Under NDA, you walk them through this." "You're serious?" "I am." She hesitated. "And what happens after that?" Julian met her eyes. "We'll see." And for the first time in a long, long time, Grace Morgan let herself hope the world was finally starting to look back. Grace Morgan's footsteps echoed softly in the empty corridors of Helios Systems long after most employees had left for the night. The sterile scent of citrus cleaner still lingered faintly in the air, a reminder of her double life. Janitor by night, silent coder by choice. She clutched her canvas bag close, heart pounding not from exhaustion but anticipation. Tonight was different. Tonight? She wasn't just cleaning floors. She was stepping back into a world she thought had shut its doors on her forever. 2 days earlier, Julian Hartman had called her into his office. The memory of that first meeting still hung heavy, the sting of his slap, the sharp disbelief in his eyes, and then the unexpected shift when he saw the code she had written, the patch that had saved the company's system from collapse. Julian's grudging respect was an olive branch, tentative but real, and it came with a challenge. To prove herself to his engineering team, to show them that the janitor in the hallway was the coder behind the firewall. Now, Grace stood before a glossy conference room door that bore no plaque, no name, only the quiet promise of opportunity inside. The muffled voices of engineers drifted out as she paused, took a steadying breath, and pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with concentration. 5 faces looked up from glowing monitors and scribbled notes, young men and women who had never looked at her before, or if they had only seen a cleaner who moved unseen and unacknowledged. Evelyn Cho, the head of cybersecurity, sat near the center, her sharp eyes narrowing as they fixed on Grace. Julian stood silently to the side, arms crossed, the tension in the room palpable. Grace's hands trembled as she set down her bag and took her place at the head of the table. She wasn't here to beg or apologize. She was here to reclaim her voice. She began by explaining the vulnerability she had discovered in Helios's system. Her voice was low at first, cautious, as if testing the waters. She spoke of the intricate flaws in the legacy code, the recursive loops that created exploitable gaps, and the way her patch had restored the system's integrity without shutting down operations. Questions came quickly, sharp and relentless. Evelyn asked about buffer sizes and recursion calls, pressing Grace to explain how her fix handled memory overflow and asynchronous processes. Kevin Lenny, the AI infrastructure lead, leaned in, dissecting her threat models with pointed queries about potential attack vectors and fallback protocols. At first, Grace's answers were hesitant, each sentence weighed down by the ghosts of years spent hiding her intellect behind a mop and bucket. But as minutes passed, a quiet confidence blossomed within her. The language of code was a language she had never forgotten, a song that ran through her veins. She spoke of sandboxing techniques, modular security updates, and adaptive AI protocols designed not just to react to known threats, but to anticipate and learn from them, much like the human immune system responds to unseen viruses. The room grew silent. The walls that had once seemed so cold and impenetrable began to soften. Evelyn Cho finally leaned back, folding her arms with a rare smile. "Where the hell did they bury you?" she muttered under her breath. Grace smiled faintly, in plain sight. Julian's face softened too, and for the first time since their confrontation, he spoke without the edge of suspicion. "You've got talent. It's time to stop hiding it." Over the following days, Grace worked tirelessly alongside the engineers, bridging the divide between her shadowed past and this fragile new future. She was granted temporary security clearance, a badge that felt heavy and unfamiliar pinned to her chest. Her late-night cleaning shifts remained, but now they were interspersed with hours spent at secure terminals deep within Helios's infrastructure division, rebuilding defenses, strengthening firewalls, and refining the very code that had once nearly destroyed her. Yet, not all was smooth. The whispers began almost immediately. An anonymous article leaked to a tech blog questioned her credentials, her background, her place within the company. Former janitor, ex-whistleblower, now Helios's security savior? The headline was laced with skepticism and thinly veiled disdain. Colleagues who had barely nodded before now averted their eyes when she passed. An intern she had helped with a debugging issue the day before pretended not to see her. The cafeteria, once a neutral ground, became a gauntlet of cold stares and hushed gossip. Her son, Eli, bore the brunt of it. At school, kids whispered and stared. Questions about his mother's job stung more than the words. They questioned her worth before they knew her story. One night, after Eli had fallen asleep clutching a crayon drawing of a woman in a cape standing before a glowing screen, Grace sat alone in the darkened apartment, laptop balanced on her knees. The glow from the screen was a lifeline. The code a reminder that she still mattered, that her mind was still sharp, even if the world seemed bent on dimming her light. Julian's voice echoed in her mind, his quiet assurance that he was trying to protect her, that this was only the beginning. But protection was fragile, and the shadows of doubt loomed larger every day. The real test came when the system was hit by a suspicious breach during a routine security simulation. The intrusion wasn't external. It came from within. Evidence was planted, carefully crafted to implicate Grace's account as the source of the breach. She knew immediately it was a setup. Evelyn stood by her side, unwavering. Together with a small team of trusted engineers, they traced the attack's digital fingerprints through layers of obfuscation and encryption. They uncovered a dormant backdoor embedded deep within the AI's code, an insidious Trojan horse that had slipped past even their enhanced defenses. Grace's heart pounded as the truth unfolded. Someone inside the company was using her own work against her, manipulating her credentials to hide their tracks. Her mind flashed to Andre Vega, the company's COO. Smooth, calculated, untouchable. Rumors had long swirled about his ambitions, about deals cut in shadow and ethics bent to his will. One evening, standing in the sterile glow of the server vault on sublevel 2, Grace confronted Julian. "You brought me in to clean up your mess," she said, voice steady despite the fire in her eyes. "Let me finish it." Julian nodded, sliding her the keys to an ancient, dust-covered safe hidden behind a false wall. A trove of legacy audit logs untouched by time or tampering. The data inside held the answers, the proof they needed to expose the rot festering beneath the polished surface. They spent hours sifting through packet captures and time-stamped command logs. At dawn, the truth became undeniable. The breach was traced back to Andre Vega himself, orchestrating a scheme to divert critical contracts and funnel profits offshore, all under the guise of company security. Julian's jaw clenched as he absorbed the betrayal. "We take this to the board," he said firmly. Grace shook her head, eyes blazing. "No, we take this to the press. Let the truth breathe where they can't contain it." Julian hesitated, then nodded slowly. "That will end him." "No," she whispered. "It'll free me. And I won't let my son grow up thinking silence is safety." 3 days later, the boardroom at Helios was colder than the autumn wind outside. 5 stern-faced members sat behind a polished desk, ready to hear the accusations against Grace Morgan. She stood alone in the center, the weight of her past pressing down, but her voice rang clear and unshakable. She presented the forensic evidence, the code logs, the hidden command sequences, the timestamps proving her innocence. She laid bare the duplicity of those who had used her as a scapegoat, the systemic bias that had sought to erase her before she could rise. Martin Greaves, the head of strategic risk and a man with a reputation for a smile too wide to trust, entered flanked by federal agents, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. The room held its breath as he was escorted out, suspended pending investigation. One by one, the board members rose, extending hands to Grace in a unanimous vote that cleared her name and restored her position. Later, at a press conference beneath Helios's vast skylight, Julian introduced her to the world, not as a former janitor, a disgraced whistleblower, or a woman marked by her past, but as the architect of the company's salvation, the mind behind the new AI defense protocols that would safeguard its future. Grace looked out over the crowd. The lens of cameras like bright stars focused on her scars and her strength. Her fingers gripped the edge of the podium, voice steady as she spoke of resilience, of value beyond labels, and the courage it takes to be seen when the world tries to look away. Behind her, the new initiative named MorganNet rolled across the giant screen, a living testament to the power of unseen hands and unyielding hearts. Her son, Ely, stood in the front row, pride shining brighter than any spotlight. When the crowd applauded, he clapped hardest of all, his small hands a reminder that sometimes the truest victories are for those who watch us from the shadows. Grace's journey was far from over, but tonight she was no longer invisible. Tonight she was finally home. The following morning, Grace Morgan arrived at Helios Systems well before dawn. The city was still quiet, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights and the occasional hum of a distant car engine. The towering glass building of Helios stood silent against the gray sky, its reflective surface mirroring the slow awakening of the world around it. Grace adjusted the navy cardigan around her shoulders, the one she'd worn for years as her armor against judgment, and stepped through the revolving doors. Inside, the sterile corridors were pristine, polished to a clinical shine that reflected the faint overhead lights. The scent of citrus cleaner, so familiar to her, mingled with the faint aroma of expensive coffee brewing somewhere nearby. Grace moved purposefully, her badge now granting her access not to the janitorial closets but to secured terminals deep within the company's cybersecurity division. For the first time since she'd started cleaning floors, she felt like she belonged here. The early morning hours passed in a blur of code and logic, fingers flying over the keyboard, eyes scanning lines of text with precision, born of countless late nights spent unraveling digital mysteries. The task was daunting, rebuilding the backup systems, designing diagnostic tools, rewriting permission hierarchies, but the code flowed through her like breath, a language that had never left her despite the years of silence. Evelyn Cho, the head of cybersecurity, was present intermittently, her demeanor as sharp and commanding as ever. At first, she observed Grace with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity, but as hours turned into days, that skepticism gave way to respect. The team began to recognize the depth of Grace's expertise, the elegant efficiency of her solutions. Yet, outside the glowing terminals and humming servers, the world was less kind. Rumors began to ripple through the company like an undercurrent. The news of a former janitor and whistleblower leading the rebuilding of Helios's cybersecurity spread rapidly, stirring discomfort among some executives and whispers of distrust in the halls. Anonymous blog posts surfaced, questioning Grace's qualifications, dredging up her past with Genesis data, painting her as a risk, a liability, a question mark on the company's shining reputation. Within the company, colleagues who had once ignored her now exchanged cautious glances as she passed. Some looked away quickly, others whispered behind closed doors. The cafeteria, the supposed neutral ground, felt cold and unwelcoming. The sting of exclusion was palpable. At home, Eli, her son, felt the impact acutely. At school, his classmates mocked and teased him, their words cutting sharper than any blade. "Your mom's a hacker? Isn't that illegal?" one boy had sneered. The innocent curiosity turned cruel, and Eli's bright eyes dimmed with confusion. But Eli's laughter still found moments to bloom. One evening, clutching a crayon drawing he'd made at school, Eli ran to Grace as she walked through the door, his face glowing with pride. The picture depicted her standing tall in front of a massive glowing screen, draped in a cape, surrounded by green lines of code that spiraled like magic. "Look, Mom, you're a superhero," he declared, beaming. Grace smiled through a tight throat, her heart aching with the weight of both hope and fear. The pressure at work intensified. The company was preparing for a major security simulation, a test of the new defenses Grace had helped build. The AI protocols were running, scanning for vulnerabilities and threat signatures. Confidence was high, but the night brought a sudden jolt of crisis. The simulation was breached, not externally, but from within. Alarm bells blared across the system. Protocols flagged an intrusion that shouldn't have been possible. Worse, the digital fingerprints led straight to Grace's credentials. The system's logs showed commands issued under her name, commands that threatened to compromise the very protections she had built. Grace felt her stomach drop. She knew she hadn't done this. Someone was framing her. Evelyn was the first to believe her innocence. "We don't have time to waste on doubts," she said quietly. "We need to find the real source before the company loses faith." Together with a trusted few, Grace delved deep into the code and the logs. Layer after layer of encryption peeled away to reveal the true culprit. A hidden, dormant backdoor planted deep within the AI's architecture, a Trojan horse masked by Grace's own protocols. Their investigation led to a name, Andre Vega, the COO. Known for his polished public image and sharp business acumen, Andre was also rumored to be maneuvering for control, willing to sacrifice anything to secure a lucrative government contract. Grace felt a cold resolve settle over her. This was no longer about proving her worth, it was about survival, about exposing corruption that threatened everything she cared for. In the dim light of the sub-level server room, the air cool and humming with electricity, Grace confronted Julian. "You brought me in to clean up your mess," she said, voice steady despite the fire in her eyes. Now let me finish what I started. Julian handed her the keys to a hidden safe, tucked behind a false wall in the security office. Inside was an untouched archive, a complete legacy audit chain, a digital time capsule that held the truth of every command, every override, every system call made since the company's inception. For hours, they worked together, tracing the shadowy threads of deception. At dawn, the evidence was irrefutable. Andre Vega had orchestrated the breach, using Grace's credentials as a smokescreen while siphoning sensitive data to offshore accounts. Julian's jaw tightened. "We take this to the board," he declared. Grace shook her head. "No, we take this to the press. We let the light do what the system cannot." Julian hesitated, then nodded slowly. "That will end him." "No," Grace whispered. "It'll free me, and I won't let my son grow up thinking silence is safety." 3 days later, the boardroom was a chamber of cold stares and quiet tension. 5 executives sat behind a polished mahogany desk, prepared to weigh the accusations against Grace Morgan. She stood alone, a figure of quiet strength, the weight of her past and the hope for her future balanced on her shoulders. She spoke with clarity and conviction, presenting forensic evidence, timestamps, decrypted audit trails, logs that proved her innocence and exposed the orchestrated plot to frame her. Her voice resonated with the truth of her experience, the injustice she had endured, and the resilience that had brought her here. Martin Greaves, the head of strategic risk and Andre's ally, was summoned and escorted in by federal agents, his face a mask of shock and fury. The room held its breath as he was suspended pending investigation. One by one, the board members rose, extending hands to Grace in a unanimous vote that cleared her name and solidified her place within the company. Hours later, beneath the vast skylight of Helios's atrium, Julian introduced Grace to the world, not as a former janitor or a disgraced whistleblower, but as the architect of the company's salvation and the mind behind its new AI defense protocols. Grace looked out over the sea of cameras and microphones, the weight of scars both seen and unseen pressing upon her. Her fingers gripped the podium, voice steady, as she spoke of the courage it takes to be seen when the world prefers to look away, of the power in fighting for one's place, and the importance of never letting silence define one's worth. Behind her, the new initiative, named MorganNet, glowed on massive screens, a living testament to the strength of unseen hands and unyielding hearts. Her son Eli stood in the front row, eyes shining with pride. When the applause erupted, he clapped hardest of all. A beacon of hope that even in shadows, light can be found. Grace Morgan's journey was far from over, but tonight, she was no longer invisible. Tonight, she was finally home. Grace Morgan never imagined she would return to the place where her career had been abruptly and unjustly cut short. Yet here she was, stepping through the sleek glass doors of Helios Systems, not as a cleaner this time, but as a temporary consultant in cybersecurity. The badge on her lapel gleamed softly under the fluorescent lights, engraved with her name and the title, Lead Systems Integration Architect. It felt surreal, as if she were wearing someone else's skin, someone who belonged. The memories flooded back in a rush as she walked the familiar halls, the scent of lemon cleaner lingering faintly in the air. Here she had once mopped floors in the shadows, invisible to those who held the keys to the kingdom. Now, engineers nodded respectfully as she passed, some offering hesitant smiles, others withholding judgment but acknowledging her presence. The whispered conversations and sidelong glances were still there, but tinged with a reluctant acceptance. At her workstation, Grace settled into the rhythm that had once defined her life, the hum of servers, the rhythmic clatter of keys, the intricate dance of code unfolding on screens. The AI Defense Task Force she now led was composed of hand-picked engineers from across the company, each bringing their own expertise, but all now looking to her for guidance. The pressure was immense. Their mission was to build a security system that didn't merely react to threats, but anticipated them, learning and adapting like a living organism. Grace's voice, once hesitant and low, now carried the weight of experience and conviction as she outlined the latest iteration of their project. Version 3 of MorganNet was more than just software. It was a sentinel, an immune system designed to detect subtle shifts in behavior, to flag anomalies not just in code, but in the intent behind it. It could sense when an insider account began acting like a virus, isolating the threat before damage could be done. Evelyn Cho, ever the skeptic turned ally, leaned back with a satisfied grunt. "I've waited 10 years to hear someone say that and mean it," she admitted. Grace allowed herself a small smile, the kind that comes from finally being heard, finally being seen. But even as the team celebrated their progress, the shadows of Grace's past loomed large. The board demanded a progress update, and with it, the inevitable scrutiny of the woman who had defied expectations and prejudice. Walking down the hall beside Julian, Grace braced herself. "They're going to bring up your past again, aren't they?" she asked softly. Julian's expression was unreadable. "They might. But if they do, they'll be looking at a woman who stands beside a system that's already doubled our firewall efficiency and tripled our internal response rate. Let them try." The conference room was stark, its walls of glass and steel reflecting the cold intensity of the moment. 8 board members turned as Grace entered, their faces masks of corporate gravitas. Julian gestured for her to begin, then stood silently, his support a quiet anchor. Grace's presentation was direct, unflinching. She explained how, in 6 weeks, the AI Defense Corps had mapped 97% of the company's internal architecture and preempted multiple phishing attempts from insider accounts. She detailed the system's impressive processing speed and its negligible latency, emphasizing that its strength lay in modeling after the most adaptive entity in the world, human fear. Her voice rang clear as she described fear not as panic but as vigilance, the kind that watches, listens, and learns. The room remained silent, the weight of her words sinking deep. Then came the interrogation. One board member, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes, challenged her lack of formal engineering credentials. Another raised her past arrests and detentions, insinuating dishonesty. Grace met each accusation with calm resolve, her past a shield forged in hardship and perseverance. "I accepted a janitorial job to survive," she said simply. "When your systems began to fail, I fixed them." A tense silence followed. Another member asked why she hadn't come forward sooner, why she had chosen back channels instead of meetings. "Because people like me don't get meetings with people like you," Grace replied firmly. "We get warnings, suspensions, handcuffs." Julian stood then, voice steady. "You all know the numbers. The press may have painted Grace as a risk, but if she walks out of this building, I walk with her. We can't afford to lose either of us." No one moved. Then, unexpectedly, Evelyn spoke from the back of the room, her tone resolute. "We've already voted. The protocols are moving to production. The question is how fast we're willing to embrace the future." Grace's heart eased as the decision was made, the weight of years of struggle lifting incrementally. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, breath slowing. Julian joined her, offering a rare moment of warmth. "That's the last time we explain you to anyone," he said quietly. Grace laughed softly. "That's optimistic." The weekend brought a reprieve, a moment to breathe. Grace and Eli ventured to the Brooklyn Science Center, where her son's excitement was contagious. Passing through the robotics exhibit, they stopped before a touchscreen display bearing the Helios logo and a headline scrolling proudly, "New Adaptive Security Core designed by Grace Morgan." Eli's eyes sparkled. "Mom, is that you?" She nodded, kneeling beside him as a staffer approached with a camera. "Would you like a photo, ma'am?" Grace hesitated, then smiled and agreed. As the camera clicked, Eli threw up 2 peace signs, his grin wide and unguarded. On the way out, he tugged at her sleeve. "Does this mean we're superheroes now?" Grace paused, considering. "Nobody needs to wear a cape to be a hero," she said softly. "We've been heroes all along." That night, tucking Eli into bed, she stood at the doorway, watching him sleep beneath the soft glow of a small lamp. The drawing he had made, the one of her standing before a glowing screen with a cape billowing behind her, no longer felt like a fantasy. It was the truth. Monday morning dawned quieter than expected, the calm before a storm. Grace entered the Helios lobby, badge gleaming and shoulders squared. The recognition she once yearned for was now tentative but real. She exchanged greetings, not as a shadow, but as a leader. In the elevator, a young programmer named Jesse approached nervously. "Miss Morgan, my dad saw your interview on Channel 6, he said. He said you remind him of my mom when she fought for her teaching license back in '84. Grace smiled, humbled. "Tell him thank you, and tell your mom," I said. "Respect." But as she stepped off on the executive floor, her smile faded. A tall, unfamiliar man in a crisp suit stood just outside Julian's office. His demeanor was cold, calculating, a man who didn't belong to Helios but seemed to wield power within it. Elise met Grace in the hallway, holding a folder with grim news. 3 board members who had supported her appointment had been approached by someone claiming evidence that Grace falsified not just her education, but her entire background. Grace stiffened but met Elise's eyes. "It's fabricated." "Fabricated or not," Elise said flatly, "we're being asked to provide full internal logs from your time on the AI Defense Corps." Grace nodded, voice steady. "I've got nothing to hide. Show them everything." Elise hesitated. "The problem isn't whether they believe your code is yours. It's who else may have had access to the server. We suspect it wasn't just an external breach. There may have been a double agent, someone who worked cleanup on the bugs you stopped." Grace's mouth went dry. "They're not just questioning what I did," she said slowly. "They're positioning me to take the fall for what they did." The weight of that statement settled over her. This was no longer about the past. It was about survival, about fighting a system determined to erase her. Later that evening, after Eli was asleep, Grace sat alone at the kitchen table, laptop open. The soft hum of the dishwasher was the only sound. She accessed backup logs from the AI Defense Corps, combing through every override, every command string, every system call. Her eyes widened when she found a discrepancy, a hidden call sequence triggered at 2:08 a.m., 2 nights before the breach was publicly discovered. The dormant admin port she never used, one she had disabled in her protocols, was suddenly active. The digital footprint was subtle but undeniable. Someone had been testing the waters, using her system as a Trojan horse to conduct a dry run, copying data but not executing commands. They were hiding behind her name. The next day, she met with Julian and Elise in the sub-basement, the room with no cameras, just analog security and old-school keys. Julian looked pale as Grace laid out her findings. "This is internal espionage," he muttered. "Corporate level, maybe even higher. Someone planted a backdoor not just in our AI, but across our entire network, using your work as a cover. And now they're trying to make you the scapegoat." "No," Grace said bitterly. "Not if we expose them first." Julian opened a hidden safe behind a wall panel and pulled out a drive. "This is the full legacy audit chain from before your promotion. The only untouched data set. If anyone messed with the code while you were still cleaning floors, it'll show here." They worked through the night, poring over lines of code, packets, and commands. At dawn, Julian leaned in, voice tight. "There. Deployment command issued under the credentials of Martin Greaves, head of strategic risk. The man who once asked if you knew how to spell encryption. He ran the test operation that allowed the malware in and set you up before you even had a title to fight back." Grace shook her head, fire in her eyes. "We take this to the press. Let the truth breathe where they can't control it." Julian nodded slowly. "That'll end him." "No," Grace whispered. "It'll free me. And I won't let my son grow up thinking silence is safety." 3 days later, the hearing room inside Helios was suffocating with silence. 5 board members sat behind a polished mahogany desk, their pens poised, expressions neutral. Grace stood alone, but her voice carried the weight of a lifetime of truth. A silver-haired woman named Constance Brewster broke the silence. "Miss Morgan, you've been accused of improperly accessing restricted systems and deploying untested code that potentially compromised national security." Grace nodded once. "I understand the accusation, and I'm here to present the truth. Not just to defend myself, but to protect the integrity of this company." Elise tapped a key and the first slide lit up behind Grace, a timestamp log showing the overridden command protocols. Grace explained, "I intervened because the backup system was looping, caused by a flaw in the timestamp array. But what you don't see here is just as important." She pointed to another slide. "This log shows a hidden call sequence issued 2 days before. I did not make this call." Murmurs swept the room. Grace held their gaze. "I was targeted. Someone needed a scapegoat who wouldn't be believed. A black single mother working nights with no degree and no pedigree. A perfect target." Constance frowned. "Are you implying racial bias?" "I'm stating systemic exploitation," Grace replied firmly. "This was a setup. When the system saw someone it couldn't control rise unexpectedly, It tried to erase me again. Julian stood. The evidence supports her claims. Greaves accessed admin credentials, rerouted data offshore using Grace's name as a Trojan shell. Another board member demanded, "Where is Mr. Greaves now?" The door opened and Martin Greaves was led in, flanked by federal agents. His face was red with fury and disbelief. Grace met his gaze unflinchingly. "I was a janitor. I also saved this company. You almost destroyed it." Constance turned to the guards. "Escort Mr. Greaves out, effective immediately. He is suspended pending federal investigation." As the doors closed behind him, a collective sigh rippled through the room. Unexpectedly, Constance stood and extended her hand to Grace. "You once told me justice should be quiet and thorough, that the loudest voices don't always tell the truth. Today, your voice was exactly what we needed." The panel rose, one by one, and announced a unanimous vote. Grace Morgan would retain her position, and a formal apology would be issued to her and the public. Hours later, Julian called an emergency press conference beneath the vast skylight of Helios's main atrium. Cameras flashed, microphones pointed, the room buzzing with anticipation. Grace faced the crowd, every scar and tear etched into her voice as she spoke. "I didn't come here to be the hero of someone else's redemption. I came to do my job, to protect this system, even when it didn't protect me." Her gaze swept the room. "If my journey means anything to anyone listening today, let it be this. What you look like, where you come from, or what uniform you wear doesn't determine your worth. What matters is what you do when no one is watching." Behind her, the screen displayed the name of the new initiative, MorganNet, the code she had written, now deployed to defend Helios from internal threats. Eli stood in the front row, clutching his mother's hand, his eyes bright and proud. When she finished, the applause was thunderous, but Eli's was the loudest. As the crowd dispersed, Grace slowly walked past the places she had once cleaned. The mop closet, the maintenance elevator, the break room with its burnt coffee and flickering lights. She paused at a newly installed plaque that read, "Integrity is what you do when no one is watching. In honor of Grace Morgan." Julian joined her silently. "I can never undo what I did that night," he said softly, the slap, the refusal to listen. Grace turned, meeting his eyes. "No, you can't. But you listened this time, that matters." He offered his hand, not as an apology but as a sign of respect. She shook it firmly. Stepping out into the sunlit plaza, Grace felt the weight she'd carried for so long begin to transform, not disappear, but change into something stronger. Justice hadn't come swiftly. It hadn't come easily. But it had come. And Grace Morgan had not just survived the storm, she had rewritten it. The following morning, the main lobby of Helios Systems was transformed into a bustling stage fit for political drama. Cameras perched on tripods, assistants scrambled to set up cables, and executives whispered anxiously in clusters near the back wall. A massive banner stretched across the stage read, "Innovation and Integrity, Helios and the Future of Cybersecurity." Behind the black curtain, Grace Morgan stood still, her heart pounding against her ribs as if it wanted to escape. Her navy blazer, borrowed from Evelyn Cho, was perfectly pressed, and her hair was pinned neatly back. She had concealed the bruised redness on her cheek with just enough makeup to pass unnoticed, but the ache beneath was still raw. Not just the physical sting, but the weight of years of invisibility and doubt. The world was watching. Grace was not supposed to be here. Not on a stage, not under the searing spotlight of flashing cameras and piercing microphones. She was the girl who had once wiped down tables, cleaned up after late-night meetings, and scrubbed the floors while building defenses in her mind, coding silently in the dark. Tonight, she was the center of a story no one had wanted to tell until now. Julian Hartman's voice was calm and steady as he stood beside her, adjusting his tie. "You ready?" he asked softly. She looked up, meeting his eyes with a quiet resolve. "Number one," she replied. He smiled gently. "Good. Neither am I." At exactly 8:59 a.m., the curtain rose. The room exploded with the sharp pop of flashbulbs and a low wave of murmurs. Julian stepped to the podium first but said nothing immediately. He let the silence settle over the crowd like a heavy curtain before beginning. 6 months ago, Helios Systems faced a breach that threatened to destroy our infrastructure, our reputation, and possibly our entire future, he began, voice firm and clear. The solution that saved us arrived anonymously. For months, we credited it to our internal teams. That was a lie. A stir rippled through the audience as he paused, scanning the room with deliberate intention. Today, I am here to tell you the truth. That code, the one that saved our systems and rebuilt our core protections, was written by a woman who at the time was working in this building as a waitress and janitor. Her name is Grace Morgan. The cameras swung sharply to Grace, capturing every flicker of emotion on her face. Despite the intense scrutiny, she did not flinch. The lenses felt like spotlights on old scars, but she stood tall. Julian gestured toward her. Grace is not a security risk. She is a security architect. She is not a hacker. She is a protector. And she is not a liability. She is the future of this company. Turning away from the microphone, Julian walked back to her side and extended his hand. Grace hesitated for a moment, but then stepped forward. The podium loomed larger than she remembered, and the lights felt hotter, but her head was held high and her shoulders squared. "My name is Grace Morgan," she began, voice steady and clear. "I used to write code that no one ever saw, at night, in silence, while raising my son and surviving a system that told me I didn't belong." The room fell quiet, even the photographer ceased clicking. She wasn't invisible because she had nothing to offer. She was invisible because no one ever asked if she did. Her fingers gripped the edge of the podium, and her voice grew stronger. "I found a vulnerability. I fixed it. I didn't ask for credit. I didn't ask for trust. But I'm standing here because, for the first time, someone chose to see past my job title, my resume gaps, and my past. Instead, they looked at my work." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "I am not the exception. I am the proof." The room erupted. Some stood, others remained seated, but the energy had shifted. Grace's voice had pierced the walls of assumptions and prejudice that had kept her hidden for so long. Backstage, Evelyn Cho stood with her arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the edge of her mouth. "She did it," she muttered under her breath. After the conference, Grace stepped into the hall behind the stage, head buzzing, hands trembling. Julian caught up to her, a rare softness in his face. "You did more than I ever could have," he said quietly. Breathless, Grace replied, "I didn't do it for you. I did it because I was tired of hiding." "And now they know," he said. "Now I know," she corrected. That night, Grace walked Eli home from school through Central Park. The autumn leaves were golden and red, crunching under their feet as Eli clutched her hand, swinging it happily. "Mom, you were on television," he said proudly. "Miss Jenkins said I should be proud of you," he added. Grace smiled, the pride swelling in her chest. "You are. I always was. But now everyone else is catching up." He paused thoughtfully. "Does this mean we're not poor anymore?" Her breath caught. "Maybe not poor in the same way," she said gently. "But you'll still make grilled cheese, always." They stopped by the playground, where Eli darted off to climb the jungle gym. Grace sat on a bench, watching her son, once a small boy who held her hand as she scrubbed diner floors, now laughing beneath a sky that suddenly seemed bigger and brighter. Her phone buzzed. A message from Evelyn. "Prototype past phase 2. You want to lead the next integration cycle?" A second ping came. "Julian says you get final say on design direction." Grace smiled, then put the phone away. She looked up at the sky, the last streaks of orange fading behind the skyline, and for the first time in a long, long while, she didn't feel like a ghost in her own life. She felt real. She felt ready. Grace Morgan arrived at Helios Systems before dawn, the city still cloaked in a sleepy haze as she entered the glass towers that held so many memories, both bitter and hopeful. This morning was unlike any other. It was the start of a new chapter. She wasn't here to clean floors or mop conference rooms. Today, she had a purpose that had been forged in hardship and resilience: to lead the team, rebuilding the company's cybersecurity defenses. The sterile corridors echoed softly as Grace made her way to the war room, a glass-walled sanctuary where engineers and analysts gathered like soldiers preparing for battle. Around the conference table sat a hand-picked group, young talents and seasoned veterans, all eyes on her as she took her place at the head. Grace's fingers hovered above her laptop, the sleek black device humming softly with promise. The screen lit up with a single line of text glowing faintly against a dark background. "Built without fear." Her breath caught. The message was more than code. It was a mantra, a declaration of intent. She began to type, fingers moving with fluidity born from years of practice, reconstructing the backup system from scratch, designing diagnostic tools that could detect the slightest intrusion attempts, and rewriting permission hierarchies into modular sequences that allowed for adaptability and security in equal measure. The code flowed like breath, familiar and alive, a song she'd never forgotten even when the world had tried to silence her. For hours, Grace lost herself in the rhythm of logic gates and keystrokes. Her mind sharpened, memories of past victories and defeats converging into a singular focus. Outside, the city awoke, but inside the war room, time seemed suspended. At exactly 10 o'clock, Julian Hartman entered, followed by 2 engineers, a thin man with wireframe glasses and a silver-haired woman who carried herself with the poise of someone who had seen 1,000 systems collapse and kept them standing. Julian's eyes rested on Grace as he introduced her plainly. "This is Grace Morgan." Neither engineer expressed surprise, which unsettled Grace more than anything else. "SB," the woman said, offering a hand. "We've heard the stories." Grace's heart raced as she shook it. The woman was Evelyn Cho, head of internal systems, known for her sharp intellect and no-nonsense attitude. The man was Kevin Lenny, overseeing AI infrastructure. "This is Kevin," Julian added, nodding. The session began with questions. Tough, probing questions that tested Grace's knowledge and challenged her assumptions. Evelyn grilled her on buffer sizes, recursion calls, and the intricacies of threat modeling. Kevin dissected her approach to anomaly detection and internal behavioral shifts. At first, Grace answered hesitantly, scanning for traps, wary of skepticism. But as minutes passed, her voice grew stronger, more confident. She spoke the language of code fluently, explaining concepts that had once been dismissed or overlooked. The room listened. By the end of the session, Evelyn leaned back with a satisfied grunt. "I've waited 10 years for someone to say that in a meeting, and mean it." Grace allowed herself a smile, the kind that comes when you're finally seen. Later that afternoon, Julian found Grace alone in the break room, rinsing out a coffee mug with trembling hands. He leaned on the counter beside her. "They didn't hate you," she said quietly, not turning around. "No," Julian replied softly. "They didn't." Grace exhaled deeply. "I don't know what to do with that." "Try accepting it," he suggested. She turned to face him. "It won't last." "Maybe not," he admitted. "But for now, it's yours." He handed her a small white envelope. Inside was a new access badge, her name engraved beneath the Helios logo, her title, Cybersecurity Operations Contract Consultant. Grace stared at it, overwhelmed. "I can't afford daycare," she blurted out. "I still work the late shift at the diner 3 nights a week." "We'll cover it," Julian said firmly. "You don't owe me anything. I know why you're here." His words felt real, sincere. A rare gift after years of dismissal. That night, Grace walked home with Eli's hand in hers. The crisp fall air rustled the trees lining their block as Eli skipped beside her, one sneaker untied, chattering excitedly about school, robots, and whether pizza could be programmed. At the apartment, she grilled cheese sandwiches and sliced apples while Eli begged to build a Lego fort. She laughed as he transformed couch cushions into walls, his imagination bounding free. Just then, the door buzzed. Grace almost ignored it, but then opened to find Julian standing there, one arm in a sling, holding a bright red box of STEM-themed Lego and a small brown paper bag. "I brought dinner," he said, offering a peace offering. Eli's eyes widened as he recognized the rocket launcher included in the set. Julian crouched down to Eli's level, feigning seriousness. "Critical feature," he joked. They spent the evening piecing together an wildly inaccurate spaceship covered in rainbow bricks and paper wings. Grace watched as Eli leaned into Julian's side, laughter filling the room. A sound she hadn't heard in years. "You're not bad for an old guy," Eli teased. Julian grinned. "Don't let the board hear that." Later, as Eli slept on the couch, Grace handed Julian a cup of tea in the kitchen. He accepted it, wrapping both hands around the warmth. "I never imagined this," she said softly. "Me neither," Julian replied. Silence hung between them, heavy and full. "You still have a long way to go," she said. "I know." She looked down. "And you still haven't apologized." Julian nodded slowly. "I'm not ready to say it until I understand what it means." Grace didn't smile, but she didn't walk away either. She poured him more tea and leaned against the counter beside him. "I'll take real over perfect," she said. For the first time in a long while, Neither of them felt alone in the room. A week later, Grace arrived before sunrise each day, long before most engineers unlocked their laptops. She didn't ask for breaks or chat around the espresso machine. She wore her cardigan like armor and worked silently at secured terminals deep within Helios's infrastructure division. By Thursday, even Evelyn had stopped watching her over her shoulder. Yet outside the code, Grace still felt like a trespasser, walking the glass and chrome halls like someone on borrowed time, waiting quietly for the door to slam, the favor to expire, the whispers to begin again. But that moment came not as she expected. Just after 6 p.m., Grace stepped into the data vault on sublevel 2, carrying a diagnostic drive. The precision cooling system's flickering lights cast eerie shadows as she began her scan. Behind her, a door opened. Footsteps approached, confident and crisp. Grace didn't look up until a voice spoke. Well, the prodigal hacker. She turned to see Marcus Vega, the chief operating officer and Julian's second-in-command, his gaze icy and disdainful. I wasn't aware the janitorial department had gained clearance, he said smoothly. Grace straightened. I'm a contract consultant, temporary clearance, reviewed by legal. Marcus nodded, having read the memo. It was vague, rushed, unusually quiet for something involving a woman with a whistleblower record and a reputation for disruption. She said nothing. Marcus stepped closer, arms folded. Do you know what people like you are to a company like this, Miss Morgan? Grace met his gaze. Invisible. Invisible. He echoed. Number radioactive. She said nothing, but his words hung heavy in the air. I don't care how brilliant your code is, Marcus continued. This company is on track for a government contract worth 8 figures. One bad headline, one thread of your past leaking out, and that contract vanishes overnight. I didn't ask to be here, Grace said calmly. Maybe you should leave before you're escorted out again, Marcus snapped. Grace flinched as the echo of her last walk of shame flashed through her mind. The cardboard box, the silent stairs, the long elevator ride down. Marcus leaned in close enough for her to smell the sharp cologne beneath his words. You think Julian will protect you? He doesn't protect anyone but his name. You're a phase, a temporary fix. You'll be gone by Q4. Without another word, he turned and left. Grace stood still, hands trembling, but she did not cry or scream. Instead, she stayed late that night, finding herself alone in the empty cafeteria, sitting across from Julian with 2 steaming mugs of black coffee between them. He noticed the quiet in her shoulders before she spoke. Why'd you bring me in, Julian? He looked up. Because you're good. Good doesn't matter if someone upstairs decides you're a liability. She was silent. Marcus came by today, Julian said, brow tensed. He thinks you'll drop me the moment it gets messy. Julian leaned back. Do you believe that I've been dropped for less? He sighed. Marcus isn't wrong. The board is anxious. This company is under a microscope, and your past, complicate things. Grace stood, voice steady. Then say it. Say I'm too risky. Say you regret it. Julian said immediately, I don't, but I am trying to protect this company and you. She paused, then added, let me protect it too. Let me finish what I started. Julian looked up, truly looked at her. You have an idea? She nodded. More than that, a fix. The next morning, Grace stood before a whiteboard in a secure, glass-walled meeting room. 5 engineers sat watching, scribbling notes and sipping coffee. Julian watched silently. Grace's voice was steady, hands moving confidently as she sketched diagrams of a new AI security model. A behavior-driven protocol that wouldn't just detect intrusion, it would learn from it, anticipate it. What you're proposing, Evelyn said slowly, is nearly autonomous threat intelligence. It's already half-written, Grace replied. The rest just needs time and processing power. Julian looked around the room. What's the timeline? 3 weeks, Grace said. Less if you back off the red tape. Kevin raised his eyebrows. That's unheard of. Grace smiled faintly. So is finding a janitor writing code at midnight. When the room emptied, Julian pulled Grace aside. That presentation, I wasn't asking permission. I know, she said. He grinned slightly. Good, because I already sent your designs to the AI task force. They want you to lead the pilot. Her expression remained unreadable for a moment before the reality sank in. Let it, she repeated. You earned that room today, Julian said. I just made sure the door stayed open. Grace stepped back into the hallway, heart pounding. She stared down at her own hands. the calluses from years of labor still visible beneath her nails. She wasn't supposed to be here. And yet, there she was. That evening, Eli ran up to her with a crayon drawing in hand. "Mom, look, it's you." She crouched to see him standing in front of a giant glowing screen, wearing a superhero cape surrounded by green code. She laughed through a tight throat. "Is that what I look like now?" "You fix stuff," Eli said proudly. "Like Iron Man, but smarter." She pulled him into a hug, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was pretending. As he ran off, Grace pinned the drawing to the fridge next to a faded eviction notice from last winter. One was the past. The other was finally the future. The sun had barely risen when Grace Morgan found herself standing alone in the stark, fluorescent-lit hearing room at Helios Systems. The polished mahogany table in front of her gleamed under the harsh overhead lights. But the sheen couldn't soften the tension that gripped the room. 5 board members sat behind the desk, their faces carefully neutral, pens poised, waiting for her to speak. A wave of memories crashed over Grace, the years of invisibility, the struggle, the pain. Yet, she stood firm, grounded by the truth she was about to lay bare. The air was heavy with anticipation as Constance Brewster, the silver-haired woman with the sharpest eyes among the board, broke the silence. "Miss Morgan, you have been accused of improperly accessing restricted systems and deploying untested code that potentially compromised national security. How do you respond?" Grace nodded once, steadying herself. "I understand the accusations, and I am here not just to defend myself but to preserve the integrity of this company." A tap on the keyboard brought up the first slide behind her, a time-stamped log of command overrides. "This," she began, "is the code I accessed on the night in question. I intervened because the backup system was caught in a loop caused by a flaw in the timestamp array. What you don't see here is equally important." She moved toward the screen, pointing deliberately. "This log reveals a hidden call sequence executed 2 days prior. I did not initiate this call." A murmur passed through the room as the reality of her statement settled. Grace turned back to face them, her voice growing stronger. "I was targeted. Someone needed a scapegoat, someone who would not be believed. A black single mother working nights with no degree and no pedigree. The perfect target." Constance's frown deepened. "Are you suggesting racial bias?" "I am stating systemic exploitation," Grace replied firmly. "This was a setup. The system, when faced with someone it couldn't control rising unexpectedly, sought to erase me once more." Julian Hartman rose from his seat, his posture unwavering. "The evidence supports Miss Morgan's claims. Greaves accessed admin credentials to reroute data offshore using her name as a Trojan shell." Another board member interjected. "Where's Mr. Greaves now?" As if on cue, the door opened, and Martin Greaves walked in, flanked by 2 federal agents. His face was flushed with fury and disbelief. "You backstabbing janitor," he spat. Grace met his gaze unflinchingly. "I was a janitor. I also saved this company. You nearly destroyed it." Constance turned to the guards. "Escort Mr. Greaves out, effective immediately. He is suspended pending federal investigation." The doors closed behind him with a definitive thud, releasing a collective sigh from the room. Unexpectedly, Constance stood and extended her hand toward Grace. "Miss Morgan, you once told me during an elevator ride that you believe justice should be quiet and thorough, that the loudest voices don't always tell the truth. But today, your voice was exactly what we needed." One by one, the panel members rose, and a unanimous vote was announced. Grace Morgan would retain her position, and a formal apology would be issued to the staff and the public. Hours later, beneath the vast skylight of Helios's main atrium, Julian called an emergency press conference. The vast space was alive with flashing cameras and buzzing microphones, the atmosphere charged with energy. Grace faced the wall of reporters and cameras, her every scar and triumph etched in her voice as she began. "I didn't come here to be the hero of someone else's redemption arc. I came here to do my job, to protect this system from failure, even if it didn't protect me." She scanned the room, the weight of her journey evident. "If my story means anything to anyone listening today, let it be this. What you look like, where you come from, or what uniform you wear does not determine your worth. What matters is what you do when no one is watching." Behind her, the giant screen displayed the new initiative's name, MorganNet, the very code she had written, now implemented across all Helios systems to detect and prevent internal breaches. Eli stood proudly in the front row, clutching his mother's hand. When she finished speaking, his applause was the loudest, a beacon of hope and pride. As the crowd began to disperse, Grace walked slowly past the places she had once cleaned. The mop closet, the maintenance elevator, the break room with its burnt coffee and flickering lights. She paused before a newly installed plaque that read, "Integrity is what you do when no one is watching. In honor of Grace Morgan." Julian joined her in silence. "I can never undo what I did that night," he said softly. The slap, the refusal to listen. Grace turned, meeting his eyes. "No, you can't. But you listened this time. That matters." He extended his hand, not in apology but in respect. She shook it firmly. Stepping out into the sunlit plaza, Grace felt the weight she had carried for so long begin to transform, not disappear, but evolve into strength. Justice hadn't come swiftly, nor had it come easily. But it had come. Grace Morgan had not just survived the storm, she had rewritten it. The morning light spilled softly through the curtains as Grace Morgan gently tucked her son, Eli, into bed. The small room was filled with the quiet warmth of their modest apartment, a stark contrast to the sprawling glass and steel towers of Helios systems where her life had recently been turned upside down and rebuilt anew. On Eli's nightstand sat the crayon drawing he'd made, a vivid portrait of her standing before a glowing screen, a cape billowing behind her, surrounded by spirals of green code. For the first time, Grace saw not just a fantasy, but a reflection of the truth. She kissed his forehead softly, feeling the weight of everything they'd been through, and stepped quietly out of the room. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change and challenge. Grace's life had shifted from the shadows to the spotlight, from cleaning floors to leading one of the most critical cybersecurity projects in the industry. MorganNet, the AI-driven defense system she had designed, was no longer a prototype, but a living, breathing guardian of Helios's digital fortress. The same hands that once scrubbed forgotten corners now guided the future of technology. Walking through the Helios lobby, Grace felt a strange mixture of pride and humility. Her badge bore her new title, Lead Systems Integration Architect. The golden letters shimmered under the overhead lights, a testament to battles fought and won, but also a reminder of the path still ahead. Colleagues greeted her differently now, with respect replacing the old indifference. Even the interns, who had once avoided her gaze, now sought her advice. One day, as she stepped into the elevator, a young programmer named Jesse hesitated before speaking. "Miss Morgan," he said nervously, "my dad saw your interview on Channel 6 last night. He told me you remind him of my mom when she fought for her teaching license back in '84. Grace smiled, touched by the unexpected connection. "Tell him thank you," she replied softly. "And tell your mom I said respect." But despite these small victories, challenges loomed. The corporate world was rarely kind to those who defied expectations. New faces appeared in Helios's hallways, executives from outside the company with cold eyes and calculated smiles. One such man, tall and unfamiliar, lingered just outside Julian's office. His presence radiated an icy authority that unsettled Grace. Elise met her in the hallway, holding a folder thick with documents. "We have a situation," she said bluntly. 3 of the original board members who had supported Grace's appointment were now being pressured by someone claiming to have evidence that Grace falsified not just her education, but her entire background. Grace's heart tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "It's fabricated, of course." Elise nodded grimly. "Fabricated or not, they're demanding full internal logs for your time on the AI Defense Corps." Grace exhaled slowly. "I have nothing to hide. Show them everything." Elise hesitated, then spoke with a grave seriousness. "The issue isn't whether they believe the code is yours, it's who else might have had access to that server. We suspect it wasn't just an external breach. There may have been a double agent, someone who worked cleanup on the bugs you stopped." Grace's mouth went dry. The implications were chilling. "They're not just questioning what I did," she said slowly. "They're positioning me to take the fall for what they did." That night, after Eli had fallen asleep, Grace sat alone in the kitchen with her laptop open. The soft hum of the dishwasher was the only sound. She accessed the backup logs from MorganNet, combing through every override, every command string, Every system call, timestamp by timestamp. Her eyes widened when she found it. A subtle discrepancy at 2:08 a.m., 2 nights before the breach was publicly discovered. A dormant admin port, one she had disabled in her protocols, had been triggered. The digital footprint was faint, a dry run that left no trace unless you knew exactly where to look. Someone had been testing the waters, and they had used her system as a Trojan horse. The next day, Grace, Julian, and Elise met privately in a windowless room monitored by analog security. Julian looked pale as Grace laid out the findings. "This is internal espionage," he muttered. "Corporate level, maybe even higher. Someone planted a backdoor not just in MorganNet but across our entire network, using your work as cover, and now they're trying to make you the scapegoat." "No," Grace said bitterly. "Not if we expose them first." Julian produced a drive from a hidden safe. "This is the full legacy audit chain from before your promotion, the only untouched dataset. If anyone tampered with the code while you were still cleaning floors, it'll show here." They worked through the night, scanning packets and commands. At dawn, Julian leaned over the screen, voice tight with resolve. "There, deployment command issued under the credentials of Martin Greaves, head of strategic risk. The man who once mocked your knowledge of encryption. He ran the test operation that allowed the malware in and set you up before you even had the authority to fight back." Grace's eyes burned with determination. "We take this to the press. Let the truth breathe where it can't be controlled." Julian nodded slowly. "That will end him." "No," Grace whispered. "It'll free me, and I won't let my son grow up thinking silence is safety." 3 days later, the hearing room was filled with a silence sharp enough to draw blood. The 5 board members sat behind a polished mahogany desk, pens ready, faces impassive. Grace stood alone, but her voice carried the strength of all she had endured. Constance Brewster was the first to speak. "Miss Morgan, you have been accused of unauthorized access and deployment of untested code that potentially compromised national security. How do you respond?" Grace nodded once, unwavering. "I am here to present the truth, not just to defend myself, but to uphold the integrity of this company." She stepped forward as the projection lit up behind her. Timestamps, logs, decrypted audit trails. "This code," she said, "was accessed to correct a fatal flaw in the system. But 2 days before, a hidden call sequence was initiated, one I did not authorize." Murmurs filled the room. Grace held their gaze. "I was targeted because I am an easy scapegoat, a black single mother with gaps in her resume, someone they believed could be erased without consequence." Constance frowned. "Are you alleging bias?" "I'm stating fact," Grace replied. "The system fights those it cannot control." Julian rose, voice firm. "The evidence confirms Miss Morgan's claims. Greaves used her credentials to mask his own malicious activities." Suddenly the door opened. Martin Greaves entered, flanked by federal agents. His face reddened with rage. "You backstabbing janitor," he hissed. Grace met his eyes steadily. "I was a janitor. I saved this company. You tried to destroy it." Constance ordered, "Escort Mr. Greaves out. He is suspended pending federal investigation." As the doors closed, the tension in the room lifted. Unexpectedly, Constance stood and extended her hand to Grace. "You once told me justice should be quiet and thorough. Today, your voice was exactly what we needed." One by one, the board members rose, and a unanimous vote cleared Grace's name. A formal apology would be issued, and her position reinstated. Hours later, Julian called a press conference beneath the skylight of Helios's main atrium. The room buzzed with anticipation. Grace faced the cameras, her voice steady. "I didn't come to be a hero in someone else's story. I came to do my job, to protect this system, even when it didn't protect me." She scanned the crowd. "If my journey means anything, let it be this. Your worth is not defined by your background or your title, but by what you do when no one is watching." Behind her, MorganNet's name glowed on the screens, a testament to resilience and truth. Eli stood in the front row, clapping fiercely, proud beyond words. Grace walked past the places she once cleaned, the mop closet, the elevators, the break room, pausing at a plaque honoring her integrity. Julian joined her silently. "I can't undo the past," he said softly. Grace turned to him. "No one can, but you listened this time. That's what matters." He offered his hand in respect. She shook it firmly. Stepping into the sunlight, Grace Morgan felt the burdens of invisibility lift. transformed into a legacy of strength. Justice had come. Not swiftly, not easily, but it had come, and she had not just survived the storm. She had rewritten it. Grace Morgan's journey teaches us that true strength isn't defined by our titles, backgrounds, or the roles society assigns us. It is forged through perseverance, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what is right, even when no one is watching. Her story reminds us that invisibility does not mean insignificance, and that often the most powerful contributions come from those whom the world overlooks. Despite facing systemic bias, false accusations, and harsh setbacks, Grace never gave up. Instead, she trusted in her skills, stayed true to her values, and fought relentlessly to reclaim her voice and her rightful place. This narrative also highlights the importance of believing in second chances and the transformative power of inclusion. When given the opportunity to prove herself, Grace not only saved a company, but also inspired a shift in perspective for those around her. It encourages us to look beyond surface judgments and recognize the hidden potential in everyone. Moreover, it underscores the responsibility of leaders to listen, protect, and support those who have been marginalized. In today's world, where challenges of bias and inequality persist, Grace's experience is a beacon of hope. It calls on us to be courageous in the face of adversity, to challenge unfair systems, and to advocate for justice and equality. Her story is not just about one woman's victory. It's about the possibility of change when talent and integrity are finally acknowledged and embraced. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that empower and uplift. Together, we can celebrate resilience and create a world where everyone's voice is heard.